The armed forces of Ukraine avenged Kursk and destroyed a Russian base. Meanwhile, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, responded harshly to Steve Witkoff, the special representative of Donald Trump. Additionally, Jay Divens, the vice president of the USA, was forced to justify himself after the statement by the president of Ukraine. But what is the conflict within Trump's team regarding approaches to peaceful resolution? About this and more right now. Greetings, friends, on my channel. I am Alexander Musienko, and this is the traditional briefing for you on those events that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. So, remember yesterday I was talking about the strikes being carried out on Russian territory. These strikes are also being carried out on enemy targets in the Kursk region, where units and forces of the enemy's missile troops were concentrated. So, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine officially confirmed that the defense forces struck the base of the 448th Missile Brigade of the Russian Army in the Kursk region. It was this brigade that carried out strikes on the city of Sumy on Palm Sunday. Precisely them. Units of the Drone Systems Forces, Special Operations Forces, and the Security Service of Ukraine. In cooperation with other components of the Defense and Security Forces, they attacked a number of targets in the Kursk region linked to war criminals involved in the missile strike on the city of Sumy, April 13th, 2025, and other war crimes against the people of Ukraine, specifically targeted, among others, by Ukraine, the permanent deployment point of the 448th Missile Brigade of the Russian occupiers. Secondary detonation of ammunition was recorded. The results of the strike are still being clarified. Every Russian military unit, subdivision, and their servicemen who shell peaceful cities and civilians will be identified and will definitely face retribution. The targeted and systematic combat operations against important military objects of the Russian invaders will continue until the cessation of Russia's armed aggression against our country. And my favorite part of these General Staff reports, besides the successes in striking military targets of the enemy, the most favorite and beautiful part is the conclusion of such reports, to be continued, and indeed there will be more to come. Despite everything, Ukraine's defense forces will carry out tasks to destroy the units of the enemy. Currently, units from various branches and types of troops, forces, defense, and security are fighting on the front. They are also actively working along the entire front line. In fact, the territorial defense forces of the armed forces of Ukraine systematically and daily strike the enemy. For example, just these days, units from one of the brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine destroyed a unique artillery installation used by Russia. This is the North Korean Koksan installation. By the way, regarding North Korea, Reuters conducted an investigation that clearly establishes that Russia is currently relying on supplies from North Korea. This, by the way, refutes the boastful claims of the Russians and their Ministry of Defense that they are capable of producing nearly 5 million shells per year, which supposedly allows them to sustain and conduct active combat operations on the front. In fact, they are currently holding on, as they did in 2024, mainly due to the supply deliveries from North Korea primarily through the position Kim Jong-un. In return, North Korea receives technologies necessary for the production of submarines, underwater vessels, their modernization, specifically nuclear submarines. And this is exactly where North Korea's current activities are directed, posing a threat to the interests of Japan as a US ally in the Pacific region and to the US itself. Such cooperation poses threats not only on the front of the Russian-Ukrainian war and directly to the US and its allies in the region. This is a direct threat because North Korea occasionally launches its missiles towards the Sea of Japan, towards Japan, and towards Guam, an American military base. In other words, this constant threat persists. And here, it is important to understand that, as I mentioned earlier, funds and Budget allocations do not always equate to and do not always correspond with the production of shells, ammunition, and other types of weaponry. These are processes that do not immediately translate into decisions. That is, funds are allocated, but this does not mean that the number of shells will automatically and immediately increase to 5 million. Obviously not. And we see in this case, when we talk about artillery, that this is indeed what happens, as Russia is highly dependent on supplies from North Korea. Meanwhile, the commander of a tactical group in one of the directions in the Donetsk region, Lieutenant General Serhiy Nayev, stated that Ukrainian forces have regained control of the settlement of Dnipro in the Volnovakha district and improved their tactical position in two critical directions. During this period, it was possible to reduce personnel losses by 20%, regain control of the settlement of Dnipro and also improve the tactical position. Our units are effectively working, destroying the enemy, and we see that active maneuver defense is making a difference. Because not only are we able to hold the defense, but we are also destroying the enemy in counterattacks. And this is very important. Meanwhile, Deep State reports that, according to the latest data from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the number of assault actions has begun to decline, which is related to the heavy losses in manpower that the enemy suffered at the end of March and the beginning of April. At that time, the enemy managed to significantly increase their activity. Well, actually, it's clear. The defense forces continue to operate, and one of the goals that remains is to inflict maximum losses, to prevent the enemy from carrying out large-scale offensive actions. We can already see that the preventive actions of the armed forces of Ukraine are working, as strikes on the Kursk region and Belgorod region prevent the enemy from forming a strike group, specifically an offensive force, that would allow a breakthrough into the depth of the front. This is what our units are focusing on today, and they are having successes and numbers in this. The mathematics clearly show that more and more enemies are being destroyed, and the pace of advancement is being restrained. This, as of today, is basically clear, understood, and noticeable. Meanwhile, the Russians have revealed another legitimate military target with justification, because they showed the actual location of the drone launches. And this drone control system location is in Moscow City, which means it is essentially in the center of Moscow, making it a legitimate target. Yes, RIA Novosti, the largest Russian propaganda agency, exposed the location of their operators. They published a video showing Russian military personnel controlling their UAVs directly from the Moscow City complex and essentially launching drones from there. So they showed it. Well, accordingly, they shouldn't be surprised if by May 9th or another date, something flies there and seriously frightens them, so they shouldn't relax. Meanwhile, Steve Witkoff, the indefatigable special representative of US President Donald Trump in the negotiation group with Russia, he is involved in the Middle East and concurrently with Russia, or rather the other way around. I'm not sure how it's divided, but nonetheless, Steve Witkoff appeared on the American TV channel Fox News and noted the following. According to him, he discussed with Putin the steps that could end the war in Ukraine and possibly lead to the creation of new business opportunities. And he claims that Putin allegedly approached him with a request to ensure lasting peace, which, according to him, took us some time to reach this point. But what he said is that the peace agreement, Witkoff says, concerns these so-called 5 territories, but it is much more than that. Well, likely, Witkoff is once again repeating Russian narratives, reiterating the Russian version that Crimea needs to be given to Russia, to give up Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia regions, Kherson within the administrative territorial borders, as the Kremlin desires. In other words, he is repeating the same version that was sent in an interview with Tucker Carlson a few weeks ago. Once again, the situation here remains unchanged. At the same time, the President of Ukraine, Supreme Commander-in-Chief Volodymyr Zelensky, responded very clearly and sharply to Vitkov during a press conference in Odessa on April 15th. The president made a statement, and he noted that a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia cannot include the issue of recognizing the Russian-occupied territories. For us, it is a red line to recognize any temporarily occupied territories. These representatives, meaning Vitkov, of course, are discussing issues beyond their competence, emphasized the president of Ukraine. Absolutely clear and understandable. And now it's interesting that this position contradicts the viewpoint previously expressed by the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. In this sense, a conflict situation is noticeable, as Marco Rubio stated, that there is a sequence and order, a phased approach to how one should move towards peace. And this phased approach implies what needs to be done first. The first step is establishing a comprehensive ceasefire regime, meaning ensuring a truce, and only after that, conducting further negotiations. Only in this way. There is a sequence that cannot be violated, a phased approach, and Marco Rubio emphasizes this. By the way, there's an interesting point here because a representative of the US State Department mentioned, while speaking with journalists the day before, that as of today, there is no basis to talk about progress because the war still remains a bloody, difficult battle. And for now, there is no reason to talk about any progress in negotiations with Russia. In addition, the Wall Street Journal published an article stating that there are circles within the structure, essentially close to the US president in his team, who clearly emphasize that Donald Trump needs to adopt a firmer and more aggressive stance towards Russia. And these circles are represented by those I have already mentioned: US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Special Representative of US President Donald Trump on Ukraine issues, General Nick Kellogg. That is, they are the ones proposing to choose a tougher course, and evidently they do not support or share the categorical position. Steve from Coffee, this is already clearly traceable. There is a certain conflict. We see that Volts has gone into the shadows. The National Security Advisor to President Trump after the scandal with Chet. A signal that spread across the entire United States of America. And now Rubio and Kellogg, as the Wall Street Journal writes, are effectively in opposition to Vitkov, you could say. I already mentioned that Kellogg presented an alternative plan, how he envisions further resolution. It was called the plan to divide Ukraine, but it can be said that this is more of a plan that involves the integration and deployment of a European military mission on the territory of Ukraine, under the leadership of Britain and France. It includes the distribution of zones, where they will be located, and that Western troops should be primarily in the central and western regions of Ukraine. So in this way it is defined. He proposed a certain alternative like this. At the same time, we see that Vitkov proposes, and against this backdrop there is a conflict. By the way, the American press writes a lot about the fact that supposedly there are people in Trump's circle dissatisfied with the fact that a significant role is actually assigned to special representatives in negotiations. There are representatives of classical diplomacy who want, let's say, to introduce a certain constructiveness into the negotiations and want to institutionalize it to act on behalf of state institutions officially. Obviously, we understand that this group can indeed be represented by the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. That's the situation. Let's see if we will prevail. It's like, one of them has to either change their point of view or adjust it. After this, either one of them might be sent into retirement. So we will see how they will get along. Rumors about the possible resignation of Secretary Rubio have been circulating, but we see that for now it remains at the level of rumors. Let's see what happens next. But such a conflict exists. Meanwhile, J. Divins, the Vice President of the USA, was forced to, essentially justify himself after the address by President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who stated that J. Divins is essentially trying to justify the actions of the Russian dictator Putin, to which Vance replied, however, that he stated, he has been condemning Russia since 2022, but since then has been trying to understand the strategic goals of both sides to find a solution. According to Vance, this does not mean that he morally supports the Russian cause or the full-scale aggressive invasion. Well, what can I say? I call it a triumph. The diplomacy of Volodymyr Zelensky, truly. Because, well, listen, after all, these interviews with the Ukrainian leader and representatives of the American leadership are touching because they are forced to seek justifications. We see that the Vice President of the USA was essentially forced to respond. And this, I say, is very good because it signals that we see that ultimately Ukraine is increasingly demonstrating its agency, showing, and there are narratives. What we want, there is a certain policy. There are narratives. The President of Ukraine is engaged in this information policy and openly speaks and declares what our red lines are, how we can act, and so on. And I believe that these are not accusations, this is precisely the aspiration. To reach that path, to equal relationships where there is respect for Ukraine, respect for our interests, and there is explanation and argumentation, a clear stance of our position. This is extremely important, and this episode testifies to that. Well, and the USA, in light of the fact that they are still in the negotiation process, did not want to, at least Bloomberg reports that the United States allegedly blocked a G7 statement condemning Russia for the strike on Sumy. And it is about the fact that the USA did not accept the wording of the following content, that the strike on Sumy is proof that Russia is determined to continue the war. This particular wording was not suitable. So possibly what? In the USA, they now believe that Russia is ready precisely towards peace, despite everything, even despite these terrorist strikes and threats, and the risks that remain. And the fact that more than a month has already passed, more than a month since the United States of America and Ukraine proposed the idea of a ceasefire, and Putin responds to it with his strikes, so it doesn't really seem like Russia is striving for peace. Russia can only be forced to agree to this peace, and I hope that the position of the United States will only change in this direction. In the meantime, it must be said that General Valery Zaluzhny, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, currently an ambassador, the extraordinary and plenipotentiary ambassador of Ukraine to the United Kingdom, delivered a speech and one of his addresses where he very clearly emphasized that it's not enough to be ready to die for Ukraine. One must be ready to kill for Ukraine. This is a very important message. As the Talmud says, if an enemy comes to you, rise and kill first. This is what the enemy should understand about us. Enemies should fear us, and the world should respect us. This is what we will focus on in our daily work. Take care of yourselves and glory to Ukraine.